Okay, so Mike from Australia. Mike, you are an Aussie who responded to one of my requests because I've been desperately trying to find somebody in Australia, which obviously is massive, and you're one person. So, quick disclaimer that I'm sure there are lots of people with lots of different opinions, and I'd be happy for you to walk me through some of what maybe your ideological adversaries think, so we get kind of a better variety of that. But I've been watching not just what's happening there with the COVID policies, but also the news coverage of it. And I have so many questions about your news and the way things are run there when it comes to just like what's normal. So many questions. So thank you for responding to my request. I happened to see comments, and I will say one of the best ways, if you're watching this, to send me a story idea or to be tapped for an interview like Mike is in right now is to go to my locals page, alisonmorrow.locals.com. It's where I get the most opportunity to pay attention to what people are talking about, because you can post there as well and you can direct message me and everything. And I think it's worth it because a lot of my story ideas come from there. Mike, you said you saw this on YouTube and ODYSEE, which is just a plug for ODYSEE too. They back up all my YouTube stuff if we get booted off. So go over there. The links are in the description for all my other platforms, but I do want to give locals a shout out because when it comes to connecting with me, I think that's the best way to do it. So Mike, before we get into your thoughts on the latest new rules around COVID because of the Delta variant, why don't you tell us who you are? And were you ever somebody before this that was like getting sprayed with rubber bullets by police?
I definitely wasn't anyone quite controversial. I was a federal government worker here, and that's how I mostly defined myself before I came to Melbourne. And right now, what I do is I work for a charity as an administrator. I'm also their treasurer, and I do that in a voluntary because I'm semi-retired. So yes, it's sort of, I think in many ways, I'm just your average aging person. I'm nothing special. And certainly when COVID came along, it was a bit of a shock for us all. I'm not sure how you would sort of reference that, but we just heard it on the news. It was very sort of, okay, we've got this disease coming out of China, and you're blah 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 going to get sick. And the building I was living here in Melbourne was filled with a lot of Chinese people, and they started wearing masks. I didn't know why, couldn't see why. And then suddenly we heard about this disease. And it was honestly young and old at that stage.
Are you saying you think that they were getting news from there was something going on that you were not getting in Australia?
Definitely, because I did notice that occasionally through my telephone, a Chinese written SMS would appear, a general notice. I don't think that was from our government, because they weren't appearing on TV and saying, okay, we've sent out this SMS. It was just a general SMS. Appeared a couple of times on my phone in Chinese. I have no idea what it said. So, and that was highly unusual. That sort of thing just doesn't happen. We don't have an emergency sort of call situation in Australia where they'll send out SMSs. We're a very, very calm place, and nothing ever happens here. That's the interesting part about Australia. It's boring.
Yeah, I think that's why it's so fascinating for me, because, and correct me if you think I'm wrong on this, but it feels like Australia has been kind of leading in the more stringent protocol for lockdowns and other COVID policy. But yeah, before this, I always just thought Australia was kind of like, Pura Vida, as they say, like, just surfing and hanging out in nature. And, maybe, I don't know, maybe that's how it got to where it is, because Australians are just like, yeah, it's going to be all right. It's fine. Let it go. And then before you know it, you're stuck at home.
I think that image you have of us is actually pretty correct. I live in the middle of a major capital city here in Australia, but there are swimming beaches within walking distance. So that is, a good image to project of us, because that's how we like to lead our lives, and that's what we believe that we can do most of the time. We believe that we're free people, and COVID in general has proven that we're not. We very much, we have so many rules. I think the best way I can describe this to people and to carry this on is that currently my rule situation is, and I've written a few crib notes around me, so pardon me if I look away. I have 1 hour a day in which I'm allowed to exercise. If I'm caught outside by police and they're saying, what are you doing? And I'll say, exercise. They'll definitely sort of check up on me again if they can track me down and make sure I'm only doing that hour. I have to wear a mask at all times, indoors as well. Really, I think that I may get COVID from this situation I'm in currently right now, and I should be wearing a mask. This is how crazy it is. That sounds crazy, but when you're at home, really, you should be wearing a mask. If I'm outside, definitely I should be wearing a mask, and that's even if I'm away from other people. So the 1.5 meter rule we have is that's how close you can get to people. I'm under a curfew. I'm not allowed out past 9 p.m. and the earliest I can leave home is 5 a.m. There's really no purpose for that because the shops are all closed at that stage and nothing is open. So really, what's the point of going out the front door? I'm in a 5K bubble. I cannot leave more than 5 kilometers from my home. There is no excuse that I can come up with, unless I'm going to get vaccinated. That's the one thing. But where I am, I'm near 2 main vaccination hubs, so I can easily make it within my 5K bubble. Really, they've stopped anyone that, if it's unnecessary for you to go to an office to work, then you're not to go to an office to work. So work from home wherever possible, and only essential services are open at the moment. So those things are the supermarket basically, and the pharmacies. Now, coffee shops are open, and that's generally for the working public. So I could go get a coffee takeaway, and that's about it, really. Everything else is closed. So I'm highly restricted. That's been going on now, that level of restrictions, for more than 200 days here in Melbourne. So it's put a lot of stress on us. It's very hard to sort of like hang out at home all the time and just watch TV, because that's about all you can do.
Well, especially when you're describing how much of an outdoor type of people Australians are, it's got to be tough to be in your house all the time, even more so than, say, you lived in a place where it's just snowing and raining all the time, you know? Like Seattle is not, it doesn't snow, but it rains all the time for 9 months out of the year. It's probably not that terrible for people to be forced inside, because they would be anyway. But I could imagine in Australia it would not be so fun. So tell me about this. This article is describing a protest that you went to, because I think besides just the protocol itself is the enforcement of it that's taken my attention when it comes to Australia, because we've seen these crazy videos coming out of there of people, I mean, I don't know if they're real or not, but I've like people being like chased by police and thrown to the ground, and you know, it's hard to know, like, did they really do something else, or were they just violating the COVID policy? I don't know. It's hard to know from this side of the world. But you participated in a protest where they used rubber bullets on you guys. So I'm curious, what tell me about this. Let's talk about this protest itself.
Right. Well, this is a very interesting situation we've all been thrown into. These protests have come about really because we have a lot of independent businesses here, small businesses, that have been closed down. They have no way of earning money, and the people who own those businesses are slowly going bankrupt. And so they're interested in protesting and trying to protect their income, and fair enough too. So what happens is that, and this situation is shifting all the time. but generally people started going into the middle of the city and protesting. And in Australia, generally with these protests, we're not very good at protesting, really. It's not like you guys having your BLM riots and things like that. When Australians generally go and protest, it's walk up and down the street, yell a bit, stomp your feet a bit, and just share messages of hope. And that's about it in general. We don't do anything else. There's no riotous behaviour. We're not turning over cars and burning them. We're not smashing windows. We don't even vandalise bins, basically. But the police take exception to this. And so when we've been on marches, the only time it doesn't turn violent is when we've got the numbers on our side. And that's the hope whenever we turn up to these protests. Now, what happens with this whole process is basically you gather at a time at a certain train station. You go in all en masse. You walk up to the Parliament House, and these areas are within a couple of blocks of each other, so that you don't have to walk far. We generally have an assembly there, and the violent scenes that have come about is basically they're initiated by the police. They're not initiated by the crowd. No one's afraid when they go to the protests, and this is one of the big things is that we used to regularly say that it's a family fun day out. Children go to these protests because they are so non-violent.
So this article says that people were throwing projectiles at the police, including flares and bottles.
Yeah, that was only after the police were spraying us down. Did that happen? Now, what happens in the protest is that the police like to fine people. In Australia, we don't like to put people in jail. It's something of a last resort, but we definitely like to fine you. And the COVID fines, I think I worked it out the other day that there are so many different penalties you can break by going to a protest that it could work out to about $21,000.
Well, yeah, this article said just the protest itself for a couple of let's see if I can find it. It was something around $5,000. It just, they didn't say specifically for what. They just said every protester, every arrested protester will be fined $5,452, so $5,452 for breaching the CHO directions. I don't know how much that equals in American money. Is that a lot of money for Australia?
I think you could draw certain parities between our currency and sort of like say, look, if you pay $5 for a burger in McDonald's in America, then you're paying $5 for a burger in Australia. That's what the money means to us. And really you could say, okay, well, $10 American currency would be about $15 Australian, really.
Right.
But it's sort of very much on a parity effect there. You know, burgers here cost the same amount as what burgers there do.
That is a decent amount of money. That's in the thousands of dollars, even for an American.
I'd actually call that a horrendous amount of money for any individual to pay, because that's each individual. And that's on a sliding scale as well, because that's just for breaking what we call the CHO directive. That's just the one. Now, they've got separate fines for other offences you could be committing, like being outside of your 5-kilometre zone. That's another fine. Not wearing a mask, that's another fine as well. So it's not just this one singular fine. You can stack them all up. So it really can be as much as $20,000 for an individual if you manage to be one of these very bad human beings. And that's the way you're seen in doing this. So I'll go ahead and describe this protest that we went to. Now, what we were doing was we were marching up and down, and we got to in front of Parliament House here in the state of Victoria, and we were having a bit of a yell, and the police decided that, and this is a tactic that they use, they'll try and divide the crowd and they call it kettling. And they'll try and divide the crowd. So what they do is they'll grab a little group of you And that way they can forward you off to an area where they can fine you all, then give you a directive to go home. And then if you break that directive, then you can actually be arrested, but they'll fine you. Now, we were accused of being violent to the police because we were used to this maneuver. So a section of the crowd, when it was, when we became aware that they were going to cut them off, people just ran at the police lines to overcome that line and rejoin with the main crowd. So that stopped that tactic. And the police then sort of acknowledged that, okay, this situation is beyond our control here. So we were allowed then to march over the rest of the city. But in that initial charge, 5 police were basically knocked on their ass. And they may, I think, have hurt themselves. People did not really run over them, and people were not really hitting them. They were just going in that direction, and the police decided to stand their ground. So yeah, these situations are very chaotic when they happen, but afterwards it was, I think both sides decided it wasn't a very big deal, because we were allowed then to march down a couple of the main streets of Melbourne, do our holding up the signs and everything else like that, and everything appeared to be calm and normal. Then when we decided to end the march, we do that out in front of a place called the Flinders Street Station. It's an area where these marches tend to end. And what happened there was, and I remember this, the police had cordoned off that section earlier because they anticipated our arrival there. And we went up there, and there was a problem because they'd formed definitely a line, and we had a lot of the crowd coming behind us, so you have no choice but to actually be pushed forward. And when it came to a certain stage, the police had already made their decision that they would spray us all down with chemical spray. Some people really didn't like that, apparently, so there were a lot of threatening gestures. And there's this tradition in Australia that the soccer players let off flares in their protest, and that happened at this protest. There was some young person with a flare and they were letting it off, and they generally just waved around. It's nice, pretty coloured smoke. It's not really causing harm to anyone. Now, again, the police, they're obviously following orders. After that spray, they decided that for the first time ever, and we saw the guy very distinctly. He was this young fellow. He was holding a gun type apparatus, and he fired it quite normally. He seemed to talk to the senior sergeant next to him, ask him a few questions. He looked one way, then he raised it and fired it off 5 times. That's a first ever. That has never happened in Australia, never. Because we are not violent people, and even in that situation, if you carefully examined things, the violence was just not there. We didn't get injured. They generally didn't get injured. Not at this protest. Now, at other protests in Sydney and Melbourne, the media seems to ignore that this is the situation here. Like one of the ones that was very big here in the papers here was in Sydney. A man was accused of punching a horse.
Oh, what, a police horse?
Yes, he was being asked to move on, is the way that they put it, by a police horse. Now, if you, and I assume you know horses where you are. And
I have to.
Yeah. Horses are generally pretty skittish creatures, and you have to train them especially to walk through crowds and remain handleable and calm. So basically this cop was going to walk over this guy with a horse. And that's pretty obvious to everyone. Now, this guy, he didn't punch the horse. He held his arm up and moved its head to the side. And you can see that in the footage. That's very deliberate, you know. It happened quickly, but our media here promoted it as that guy punched the police horse.
Okay, so I want to ask you about the media real fast since you brought that up. One of the
Yeah.
weirder things that I heard in a couple of the reports was the reporter say when she was talking about fines or whatever punishment you get for breaking the rules, the term she's using is doing the wrong thing. She kept like saying like this is what happens when you're caught doing the wrong thing. And it was so weird to me because I didn't know, maybe I'm missing something and that's just what they say over there. But it's like, first off, if you say you're doing the wrong thing, you're taking a stance, right, that the law is correct and that, you know, if you're breaking the law, you're doing the wrong thing. You should be doing the right thing and following the law. So to me, it's like advocating that these people who are choosing to not do this or to do that are doing the wrong thing, which is a value judgment, in my opinion, not just stating the fact, which could be you're breaking the law, but are you doing the right thing or the wrong thing by breaking the laws? Depends on who you ask, right? One person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist, as they say. So is that a normal way for the news to present things?
Oh,
Or is, what's going on there?
absolutely, because and this is part of the situation here is that you're given the choice that you're supposed to make when it comes to these rules, and anything outside of that choice is breaking the rule. You can't go your own way. I like the analogy that your father made about cookbook medicine, that they refer to the cookbook. Generally, Australian society is all about those cookbooks, and those cookbooks are everywhere. So when it comes to these rules and choices that have been made through COVID, the choice has been made for us by the experts. We are not the experts, so we are not in control of anything. We are continually told that we don't have the full knowledge. So they make the choices for us, and our choice is to make their choice. You don't have your own choice when it comes to anything COVID related, definitely. And it goes towards our general attitude.
What are the, so are you saying, to go back to the media, but I do have another question about, because we have the Constitution, which one might argue, I'm not sure how much it means anymore, but in our country.
But something very specific to say about that in relation to all of this, and that is, your culture bleeds into our culture very heavily when it comes to your rights as an individual. Australians generally believe that we have freedom of speech here in this country, and any of us who know differently really acknowledge that we don't have freedom of speech. We have a document that tells us what we can say and how we are supposed to say it, and anything outside of that gets you in trouble. And that's just the reality of it. So we have these confusing things of where your culture has obviously influenced ours, and we make these mistakes.
What is then the culture of speech and questioning authority when it comes to the press? Because you're saying that like the citizen is sort of being told like, you know, this is the parameter in which you're allowed to have little debates, but don't stray outside the lines. Did the press see themselves as they're allowed to go outside the lines and they should be holding authority accountable, or no?
No, absolutely not. If anything, they forward the authority because, and I'll mention an article I saw in this morning's news. I try not to watch the Australian news anymore because it's nothing but alarming and depressing. Here we're going to introduce the COVID pass, and it's causing people great alarm because we've had our two state premiers basically stand up, and I'll paraphrase them both as saying, we're going to introduce the COVID pass. Those who are not vaccinated, beware. They've directly threatened the public in order to try and drive us towards mass vaccination. Now, how that, sorry, I've forgotten where I'm at. Alison? Yeah, it was.
Yes, what we're talking about, what you were just talking about is the passports, and I'm just bringing this up real fast so I can show people. Hang on, wrong screen. Here we go. All right. Australia to trial vaccine passports over coming days as post-COVID opening preparation begins. Now, this is CNN, so take it for what it's worth. But they say Australia closed its borders almost 18 months ago in a bid to contain COVID-19. But now with vaccination rates rising, the country is possibly just months away from relaxing restrictions on international travel. You guys are at 80% of adult population has received both shots, and those people will be allowed to travel overseas. This is Prime Minister Scott Morrison saying this.
Correct.
So is that what you're talking about?
No, I'm talking about COVID pass to lead my daily life.
Okay. So not even to just travel. So you're going to need that for what specifically? Like to go to restaurants, gyms and stuff?
To do anything outside of restrictions. So once we reach 80% double dose in the population, we will, therefore, those double dose people will be able to go out and dine. There will still be restrictions on the amount and numbers of people able to do that. So what happens there is that if you're not vaccinated, you will not be allowed to go to a restaurant. That just won't be happening for you. We've been told that. The lowering of restrictions will happen at 70% double dose for people. They're now, as incentive for the carrot to the stick, at 70% single dose. I think they're going to introduce something here in Victoria next week where a group of 5 people may assemble and talk to each other at 70% single dose. Before then, obviously, you can't do that right now because they discourage any contact with any person at the moment. It's so shocking, I find it hard to explain.
Well, let me ask you this, just for people who, because I don't know how the government works over there. Can you explain federal government versus local government and how and who's in control of all this stuff? Like, because like we have the states versus the federal government, right? The states have the ability to say, you know, we're going to sue the president, the executive branch over the rules. And, you know, there's all that fighting. Of course, we, the taxpayers, pay for all of it. Okay. We pay, and that's one thing that really bugs me when it comes to all of these legal battles that are now ensuing over COVID is that, you know, average people have to foot the bill to fight the government. They're also paying to fight them back. You know what I mean? And that has never stood well with me, that we pay for the government to figure out whether what they're doing is legal or not, you know? And I don't know what the solution to that is, but you'll never win the financial battle when it comes to fighting them legally here because we pay for them to fight us.
Yeah. That's very much the same here. Our federal government is, and that's Scott Morrison is currently Prime Minister at the moment. And that's why I claim that we live in a communist state, because we don't vote in him as an individual, we vote in the party. So what's happening there is that he will be the leader for the state representatives, our premiers, and he gives them directions. He sort of puts together a general plan, and then it's up to each state premier to enact their version of the plan. Like the restrictions I have here in Victoria may be different from the ones in Queensland. So he then, therefore, and this goes for the COVID pass thing, is that they're creating the software and the means for managing the COVID pass. And it's up to the state premiers then to dictate how that's going to be applied to the populace within their state. One of the things that we can, that I'm thinking of is that if my conditions are too restrictive here, I'm going to jump on my bicycle and I'm going to ride to the border and sneak over sometime in the middle of the night to a state where there's less restrictions. Because we're not very good at closing off borders, even though internally all of our borders at the moment are closed off. There's no way that you can go from state to state in Australia without quarantining for 2 weeks. And that sort of applies if I want to leave Victoria at the moment and I've got a reasonable excuse, I have to fill in a form, I have to go through a process. And then if that's accepted by the recipient state, then I'll go there and I'll quarantine for 2 weeks. Now that's, let's say, to visit if and if I qualify. And if I want to come back in the same sort of traveling movement, so it's really, you could use the example if I want to visit a sick relative, but that's certainly by no means going to be granted. And if I want to come back, then I have to quarantine for another 2 weeks. So that's a total of 28 days I have to quarantine for to travel between New South Wales and Victoria at the moment. And that's with permission. And really, dying people are not a good enough excuse. That happens all the time.
Is that vaccinated and unvaccinated, or just unvaccinated?
That's everyone.
Okay.
That's everyone.
And
vaccinated.
You're talking about quarantining, and that reminded me that you all have actual quarantine camps, right?
Not at the moment. We have.
This one says construction is underway, I guess.
Yeah.
At Melbourne.
Yeah. We're constructing these purpose-built facilities because most of our difficulties came about because here in Victoria, we quarantine in the hotels. And unfortunately, the government here got embroiled in a situation where contracts were awarded for that service, shall we say, without a proper process necessarily being adhered to. So there was a lot of problems there. But the result of that is that COVID got out of the quarantine hotels, and the general infection, this is first wave here in Victoria, it got into our old age pensioner homes here, the government run ones, the ones which we've had what we call royal commissions into, because people often lie in their own urine and aren't looked after very well at all. And this has been going on for at least 20 years, that they've had all sorts of inquiries into these old age pensioner homes. Nothing's ever been resolved really, and these people are kept in dreadful conditions. So yeah, COVID got in there, and a lot of people died. About 1,000 at the time. It was a little bit more than that, but it's a rough number. And well, the blame for that, someone had to be blamed. So yeah, it didn't work out well for anyone. And the thing is that you find there's a lot of that in Australia, that services that should be there aren't there because they're underfunded, and well, really, it only becomes apparent when someone dies. You could say that about our hospital system too. It's a real travesty of just bad mistakes.
Okay, so they're trying to sell it like it's like an Airbnb or something. I think this camp here. Yeah. Well,
absolutely. See, you could look up,
and you're paying for it, right? Funded by the federal government. So
yes, they hand their money to private companies who are running these facilities for profit. Now, basically, if you're an old person and you have a bit of money under your belt, they'll make you buy your little room there in this facility, and it'll be a private facility then. And yes, it appears that you're well looked after, but they're not staffed well. These facilities are generally staffed by people who are either new to Australia or are foreigners, because Australians don't want to do this sort of care work. So there's really, the qualification standard is quite low for someone to actually work in these facilities. I think, well, if you were going by your standards, by our standards, it's quite acceptable.
It's for people who are traveling into the country. Is that what these are for?
Now the quarantine facilities, what they're planning to do is build a couple of them in each state, because they got this idea from our Northern Territory, who had a miners' camp, which was not being used at the time. And it's all lovely outdoor sort of little huts and things where, they've got an air conditioner in each room, a toilet facility, and a little veranda, so that you can go there, You can basically, it's like I suppose a holiday village. Do your quarantining and then you get let out at the end of it. They're quite communal in ways because you can wave to people on the next balcony and talk to them and things like that. Now, in the rest of Australia, we didn't have these facilities. We were using hotel quarantine, and because that quarantine was regularly being breached, they've decided that we should have one of those in each state because it's too far to travel to the Northern Territory. It's logistically impossible. So we'll have one in each state. We'll have one for international travelers. They've also speculated that we have those for people who are traveling within Australia as well. And I think it's an incredibly bad idea and it would be almost impossible to do, but they're going to do it anyway. Yeah, so it's not great. It really isn't great.
Okay, so let's go back to what you were saying about Australians as a people who are just going along to get along, not necessarily like ruffling the feathers. Do you feel like a lot of people just thought it wasn't going to get to this point, and so now you have protests? Were there protests early on, or did people just think it was going to just go away? I'm just curious, you know, how ideology has changed over time among people who, like you're describing, what do I know? But you're saying, like, you know, we typically just want to get along. You know, we're not necessarily trying to always be out, you know, pushing back on the government and saying that they're tyrannical and taking us over. It's just not necessarily something that because I do think Americans do that, you know, but you're saying that Australians don't necessarily, that's not part of the culture. So how did it turn into that? You know, and do you think that people waited too long, in your opinion, to start questioning this kind of stuff because they're like, you know, whatever, it'll work itself out?
I've got to bury the myth straight away. Paul Hogan or Crocodile Dundee, you guys seem to get into a lot. He's dead and buried. He hasn't existed in this country for a very long time. Generally in our cities, we live in ethnic conclaves. With very sort of defined borders. I could tell you which ethnicity lives in which suburb here in Melbourne. And because of that, we tend to, each of these ethnic enclaves are isolating from each other as well as from Australian society in general. Where I live, here in Melbourne City, there is a very high population of Asian people, mostly Chinese, Taiwanese, and everything else like that, where if you went to one of the outlying suburbs here, there's a lot of Somali people, or you could go to another suburb and say, there's a lot of Italians here, or there's a lot of Indian people or people from Pakistan. And this is part of our fabric, and it's actually really good because it overlaps in really amazing ways. The cultural exchange that happens there. But if you go to the middle of these areas, like I know of Chinese, shall we say, shops in my area, which don't have any English signs in them, and that's fine, that's okay. And some people, you could actually move into the middle of these enclaves and speak your native language, and there's no need to learn English. So this is how we generally live in Victoria. I can pretty much say that about most cities in Australia, especially Sydney. They do the same. So we have this great melting pot, and I think what has happened is that we need our rules defined for us. And part of the problem with the COVID mandates that they've been producing through the government is that they have reluctance because we have people who don't understand or have a proper concept of what something means in English. So they're having to do a lot of on-the-ground translation, which is, I don't think people have been aware of it, but I don't think we've been aware of the extent of the issue. And so it makes it a little bit difficult. We have holdout populations. The compliance to all of these COVID mandates, restrictions, or whatever it is in my area here in the city is actually quite high. Now, if you want to put that against an ethnic population bias in the city here, then you can do that. But in Australia, if you try to do that, you'll be vilified. You'll be ripped to pieces. They really don't like acknowledging these things. Although we're all aware of them, you can't hold it against anyone for being who they are. And that's the society that we live in Australia. I myself, I'm very much, even though I may sound Australian to you, I'm first generation Australian. My parents were English, what we call 5-pound poms. And because of that, I'm always called Pommy here by other Australians, because in some ways I may be well spoken. I generally speak English. Strine is my second language, and that's your Australian vocabulary. So we acknowledge difference, but you're certainly not allowed to point it out. You know, that'd be a horribly racist thing to do.
So tell me, so you're saying that because of it feels like you're describing a place that has a lot of different kinds of people, but not necessarily a lot of interaction among the different kinds of people. Or am I missing a nuance here? It sounds like everybody kind of lives separately.
More nuanced, because we do interact. It's just that we seem to have developed a very extensive rule set to do so. And those are unconscious rules. Like,
and you're saying that those have kind of, are you saying that that has kind of set the stage for then having more rules and accepting more rules, how to interact with COVID?
Yes. Yeah. Look, everything needs to be defined, because at the moment they regard what we call vaccine hesitancy as more of a language issue, that you don't understand what we're telling you to do. And that's why there's vaccine hesitancy. The Australian government refuses to acknowledge anything else.
Do you believe that?
Oh, absolutely. For myself,
no.
I'm not getting
what I meant was, do you believe that the people who are hesitant about getting the vaccine, it's just because they don't understand the language, or is there another reason that people?
There's another reason. We unfortunately, because of the side effects of the vaccine, and we know this with all vaccines, some people die from it. And we took on AstraZeneca here in Melbourne, in Australia, as our main vaccine. Now, there's a problem with it, that certain people, depending on age, depending on your sex or anything, that you'll get cerebral thrombosis from it. And it's very rare. It's probably 3 in a million people. But the thing is that, that was advertised heavily by the media, and the media took that up, and now the message has gone out that AstraZeneca is not the vaccine to have, but that's the majority vaccine that we've chased. Now we're getting in Pfizer, and they keep on changing the rules for who's getting Pfizer, because they were saying that, okay, well, we know that women are particularly vulnerable to this cerebral thrombosis, and they have to be under menopausal age. Anyone who's over menopausal age and a woman can have AstraZeneca, and they're fairly safe from this thrombotic condition. That's not perfect, but it's generally the rule. So we had our government issue the instruction of, okay, well, we only want people who are 60 years and older to have AstraZeneca, and that was fine. But then, because of slow uptake, they issued an edict saying, well, guys, anyone the age of 40 can now have it. And it seems that the medical reason for not having it, they've invalidated that and changed the rules. And now to this day, it's anyone over the age of 16 can have AstraZeneca. So they've completely backflipped, and the message has become so confusing that people are just going, all right, I just don't want AstraZeneca now. And it doesn't matter what age I am or anything. I prefer to have one of the others. But the others have been in short supply, because that's not the one that we manufacture here in Australia. So Pfizer is the preferred by everyone at the moment, because they have the name. I do believe that Novavax will be available here in Australia when it's approved. And to my mind, is probably going to have the least amount of issues because it's not mRNA based. But you won't hear about it in the general media. The general media are very cagey about what they say now. And they're being very, very careful. And what they've done is they've created a state of national hysteria, so that in combination with the government and their message and the way the media has been acting, everyone is scared to the point of they are willing to do anything at the moment. They will do exactly what they're told. This is a dystopian nightmare. 1984 come absolutely true. Everyone that I know of here in Melbourne is frightened. And I mean frightened to the extent of being frightened out of their skins. I have business people that I know saying, I have to get the vaccine now because I'm afraid that my business won't exist in a couple of months' time. I have couples coming up to me and saying, if I ever want to travel, then I have to have the vaccine. I have people like myself, if I want a social life at all, then I should get the vaccine. Now I'm being strong and I'm saying, look, I have medical issues, but even if I go to my doctor right now and say to him, look, I really think that I should hold off on the vaccine for these issues, and you know my medical issues, he's not going to agree with that. He's actually going to argue against it. And that's just part of what's happening here. I have, and to get into that a little bit more, I have blood coagulation issues at the moment. And the thing is that I know that I will not be given an exemption through my doctor. He just won't do it. He's not that type of person. He's a cookbook doctor.
Do you guys have religious exemptions over there?
No. Religion is not an excuse for that sort of thing. So what are you going to do? In fact, our Muslim community, who would probably be the most against having vaccines, have come out, and of course that's been in the media. All their leaders have announced that, yeah, it's fine to have the vaccine. You have a religious exemption to have the vaccine.
Who are you talking about said that?
The Muslim community, the Islam. Yeah.
So, well, I'm curious, what about churches in Australia? Churches in the United States have been, I think, some of the strongest advocates for pushing back on the government. Not necessarily vaccine related, but definitely lockdown related.
Right. They've tried one or two, certainly not the mainstream churches, but independent little churches. Shall we call them the worshippers of God, who are not Catholic, basically. If they try and hold a service because of our restrictions, they will definitely, and it's already happened here, a pastor has been jailed. And the way the system works here is that he's given bail conditions, which would stop him from hosting his church. And that's the end of that then, because if he wants to get out of jail, then basically he has to meet those bail conditions. And they've already done that here in Victoria. They've arrested a pastor for conducting church services.
So what do you plan to do then if life is going to change so dramatically? And I do actually have another kind of big picture question. So you're saying when you hear from people, their main reason that they're frightened, or their main reason about their concern over the getting the vaccine is related to life. It's not they're frightened that they're all going to get wiped out by COVID. It's that they're frightened that their life is going to change forever if they don't submit to these policies. Is that what you're saying they're so scared about that you're hearing?
I'm saying it's general hysteria because it's all of the above.
Okay.
The fear is overarching everything, all aspects of life. And as far as myself, because well, I'm very much an independent person. I am not going to submit. I believe that I shouldn't have the vaccine. My life, I can see it becoming quite difficult because I will be under COVID restrictions while everyone else will be able to do it. And the thing about these states of fear is that if I attempt to go to a restaurant, the waiter will be asking me for my COVID pass. And as soon as I say, look, I don't have one, then service will end for me. They just won't take my order because it's too risky for them to actually get a fine. And those fines will be, I think it'll probably be about $10,000 per instant. That it won't be worthwhile for them to deal with me. So they'll just say, sorry, mate, no service. And they'll leave it at that. That sort of thing is already happening here in many ways. When we're in lockdown, what I call lockdown 1, we're up to number 6 now. And I've still got it because I like to be reminded of it. I went to, I don't know what your American version is, maybe Home Depot, but we have a very popular hardware store here. It's very much the thing for Australians to renovate their own properties and try and improve them to sell them later on. But it's called Bunnings, and Bunnings hardware, it's very, very popular. But while I was in Bunnings, and I pretty much knew that something was going to happen, I don't wear a mask. I don't like wearing a mask. I think it just feels restrictive, and really a bit of plain fabric is not going to stop COVID from getting into you if it's going to get into you. So I don't wear a mask. So I walked in there, and the first thing was I was pulled up by one of the people at the front door, and they said, where's your mask? And I said, look, I'm not required to wear a mask. I have a medical exemption. They're not allowed to check that. They will try, they will ask. But if you stand your ground, then they'll back down to a certain extent. So Bunnings decided to, and I'll try and hold this up, to, give me a sticker to wear. Now, it says, I'm exempt from wearing a face covering. I really think that if I'm not wearing a face covering...
Mike, can you hold it up just closer? To your left? To your left. Can you go other way? And move it. Right. Yeah. Okay. I am exempt from wearing a face covering. Got it. Okay. Yep. They gave you that at the front.
Yes. And I asked the purpose of this sticker. And they said, oh, this is so that the general public doesn't attack you. And the staff has acknowledged that you're allowed to not wear a mask. And I'm just looking at this guy going, I really don't understand this, because I really think that people can see that I'm not wearing a mask. I really think that stuff, and they said, oh, well, it's to stop them from, harassing you and things like that. And I said, I think you'll find that maybe in World War II that these little yellow stickers didn't stop people from being questioned about what's happening with them. And they just, okay. So I faked putting it on because I was walking away. So I faked just going like this. And I walked through Bunnings and I purchased what I had to purchase. They didn't ask me at the checkout. Now, while I was there, the staff member asked me for customer feedback. How was your experience in Bunnings today? I shouldn't have answered the question. I should have just left. But I just looked at her and I said, look, it's a completely ridiculous situation that I am forced to wear this silly sticker. And someone behind me heard me, and she immediately kicked up and decided that what I was saying was completely unreasonable and that I should shut up and move on. So I said to her in a most unpleasant fashion that she should be quiet about this. And the staff took exception, and suddenly 4 large, burly homeware staff appeared around me and escorted me to the front door quite succinctly. I'm not generally a violent person or anything else like that. I'm not a fighter of that sort of type. But they certainly, hurried me to the front entrance and then said certain things to me which I wouldn't dare say to anyone else, and try and goad me into fighting. So, yeah, it was not nice. So I've learned my lesson. I don't oppose the crowd here.
So
because
now
they
you're
are
gonna,
that.
are you saying that you learn your lesson, so you're just gonna wear a mask now, or you're not gonna?
No, I'm not going to stick around long enough to be questioned. I'm just going
Oh,
to leave.
okay. I see. I see. Just in
Um,
and out, in and out.
yeah,
Hey, okay, Mike. One last quick question before we wrap this up. So
yeah,
this is ABC News in the States, all right? Their title is Fortress Australia cautiously moving away from COVID zero, but there's still a long path to freedom. Okay, so they first off they're calling you Fortress Australia. I guess is that the nickname because of the tough rules over there. Nation has adopted one of the world's strictest border policies, and um and I just want to read you this as kind of a, the devil's advocate approach. Like, you brought up people who think it's great to be forced to wear masks, and maybe there are people who like the lockdowns, and maybe a lot of people. I don't know. I don't live over there. You can tell me. But they're writing here that Australia's approach to the pandemic, strict border policies, snap lockdowns, aggressive contact tracing, saw the country, along with neighboring New Zealand, praised throughout 2020 for taking a no tolerance approach to public health. It paid off. While other countries faced overwhelmed hospital systems and devastating death tolls, Australia enjoyed large public gatherings and life went on as normal for most people within its sealed off borders. But confronted with rising cases of the Delta variant, the Australian government has announced a dramatic shift, planning now to live with the virus rather than stamp it out entirely. In short, Fortress Australia has been breached. What do you think about that description of Australia? First off, like, did life, it doesn't sound like talking to you, that life didn't change for most people within its sealed off borders. That seems wrong, but you tell me. And then, they're saying, hey, listen, there were a lot of people that said it was great what happened in Australia because you didn't have all these other problems that other countries do.
we,
Would you mind just responding to our media coverage
yeah.
of what's changing in Australia?
Um, it's hard not to compare Australia right now to China directly in what's happening here. We are a fortress. Not only is it hard to get into the country, it's impossible to get into the country, really. Our Prime Minister has come out and said, well, we're slowly getting people into here, but you can't get a flight here. And there is definitely a law in place where I can't leave. I cannot leave Australia. I cannot get onto a plane and fly overseas, because probably at this moment in time I would instantly. I'd get on a flight, I'd fly off to London, I'd have a nice holiday over there for 6 months at least. Probably until the end of 2022 is probably best. And I would spend my time overseas, because what is happening here is not going to end. We are an island fortress. You can't get in unless you're a celebrity appearing in a Big Brother house, apparently. They seem to be able to cross our borders. You might have seen over there that Chris Hemsworth is home here in Australia at the moment. He got into trouble here because he went down to the beach, which is more than 5 kilometers away from where he lives, to do some exercise, I think, to keep fit for his next film or whatever. So he was vilified in the press. So Fortress Australia, very appropriate. I can't go out, I can't come in. And that's down to a state level. That's down to probably my own home, because it's difficult to go anywhere without being restricted in what I do. And that's the way it is until we reach this maximum vax limit. So our first hurdle is 70% one vaccination, but that doesn't afford you any freedom.
So in the article, when they say that life has gone on for most people as normal within the borders, you're saying that's not true?
That's absolutely not true. And that probably just happened within the first couple of months of COVID. That certainly stopped completely when we had our first lockdown. So I feel there's no freedom here. It's that bad. People are just scared, huddling at home. We're now having deaths of people at home. It was tragically announced that a 20-year-old died at home, and I can only put it down to really that they were scared of going to hospital and what that meant restriction-wise and quarantine-wise and everything else like that. So they died at home, untreated.
So, all
and
right.
that's a situation where.
So to that point of, people making decisions, well, again, don't know specifically in that case, but let's just assume that it was messaging from, say, the media. We have our own issue with our press around the hysteria and negativity, not necessarily just with COVID, just with everything. It's just, that's just how it works. I was in the news business for a long time. It bleeds, it leads, as we say over here. What would you say is the role of the sort of mainstream legacy press in Australia in where you are today? Do you feel like it's similar to some of the critiques people have had of our press here, that it just pushes the government narrative, doesn't really question it? Or do you feel like, there's other influences, maybe the media is not as important over there? I again, would love to visit Australia. Probably not going to happen anytime soon, obviously. So I don't know. I'm relying on you as my correspondent over there. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
The mainstream media here is, I think, to blame for everything, because if there's no news, that's not good news. They will hype up anything. As quite a good example is that Sky News here had a little article last weekend that a protest was thwarted, was the very words that they used, in one of the squares here in Victoria. So the police actually thwarted this protest. Now, when you saw the footage for the protest, it was 5 ladies sitting in a park. They weren't wearing masks. Yeah, and the police, I think, had decided to fine them. There was no protest. Now, that's just an example of what goes on here. And the narrative from the media, because they feel that they've sinned in certain fashions with what happened with the vaccine, they're now right behind any message of the government. There is no opposing view. That just doesn't exist, to the point of, it's sort of very difficult, hard to relate, because there isn't an opposing view of any type. We did have 2 TV stations report on that nasty Mr. I think his name was Joe Rogan, about this horse medicine he was taking. And that's one of the things that is actually also banned here in Australia, that the Medical Association has banned that horse parasite medicine, even though we discovered it, that if you put some COVID in a dish and then put some of that stuff on it, it kills the COVID. But you won't hear that message in Australia. The only way you'll hear that message is by watching the internet. And that's why, and a lot of the thinking people in Australia, they don't watch the mainstream news anymore. It's not factual in any way. It's just a beat up on everything. So you don't want. I this morning watched the news for a little while to try and catch up with the local news for this interview. Big mistake. It was not pleasing to me. It just reinforces all the negativity. It's not giving me a positive message as an independent thinking human being, and there are no opposing views on it. If people realize that, and sorry, I'll just quickly add this, we have our first real political prisoners about the protests here in Melbourne. There's a gentleman called Nathan Patterson. He is what I call a cage fighter. He tried opposing and he was crash tackled and arrested, and his crew and the 5 people who were with him were beaten up by the police. There's actual footage of it. Now, as he has said there, that he was going home. He'd taken the police caution that he'd received and decided to go home. So they followed him home and crash tackled him and beat his people up and threw them in jail, and gave him bail conditions where he couldn't meet the bail conditions really, and tell people about his story, because they were multimedia bail conditions. Now, there's also another young lady called Monica Schmidt, and she has been sort of a political protester of various different types and was hoping to gain a seat in our state parliament here and be a senator or whatever. And she was recently arrested for a charge of what we call incitement. She had used multimedia to push her agenda too hard, and thinking she's one of these innocent people who believe that they have freedom of speech, she has been arrested. She's being held in solitary confinement for at least the next 2 weeks because she's a COVID risk. So she's got to be kept in confinement to not infect the rest of the prisoners. And the thing is with her is that they've attached such bail conditions that there's really no way that she wouldn't be able to break them immediately when she got out. So she can't do that. Now, the incitement charge is far-reaching. It's very vague. She now gets treated like a terrorist. I can guarantee you that. She'll be vilified in the press. And all she wanted to do was do a bit of protesting about the whole situation here. And she's been arrested, held in solitary confinement. And she may get out when she has her bail hearing in about a month or so. But that's if she can get her bail conditions sort of modified, I believe.
Mike,
and she's
before
just
we go, go ahead. Sorry.
She's just a normal person. She's just a weird little girl with an opinion, and she's been held like she's a dangerous criminal.
Well, so, and I guess that kind of big picture brings me to my final question, unless there's something else you'd like to add, which is where does this end? I mean, because I think a year ago, a lot of us really wondered, and we all have different rules governing our countries, right? So it depends on what your protections are, but it also feels like it kind of doesn't, because we're all facing very similar situations in a lot of ways. And even though we're like, we have free speech and we have a constitution, we've still had people arrested at protests. We've had, pastors who have faced jail time. And it's just I think it's really showing a lot of us that maybe we really didn't have the freedom we thought we did. That in fact, if you were to peel back some of the layers on the laws, that the government has a lot of power. They've got a lot of power that maybe we didn't realize they had. So I'm curious, like, what's your message to people? You're just an average guy. You live in Australia. You're concerned about where it's headed. I'm sure there are a lot of people that will be watching this video that feel the same way. That are like, dang, like I didn't realize that there was this David and Goliath thing happening even before this, because I don't know this. I don't think necessarily this is new. They're just using the power that they probably already had, and we'll see if the lawsuits work. I question our judicial system nowadays and what they're worth anything anymore. And so even if you sue, first off, you have to be able to afford it. Secondly, you got to be able to beat them at their own game, which I feel like is near impossible. And we pay for their attorneys so they can always ride it out longer than we can. What do you think this looks like at the end? Where do we go from here?
This doesn't end. We've already figured that out here from a statement from one of the health ministers who was deferred to in a conference here. Let it slip, and this is why New South Wales, shall we say, friends they slipped up massively, because this little health minister had then said, okay, we've got COVID passes and things like that, but and this is paraphrasing her, she let it slip that we'll be in for booster doses. So I have no expectation that the COVID pass will ever end here, because what they're going to try and do, I think, is make it so that your COVID pass drops out of being valid until you get your booster dose. Now, we know that, we'll be requiring booster doses, but your antigens drop then afterwards in a continual motion, so you'll need another booster shot in 6 months' time. or 12 months time, or whatever time period they do set on it. So that means this isn't going to stop. It's not going to stop anytime soon, because they are only relying on the vaccine here in Australia. So, and that means that for everything, it just won't stop. It'll never stop. And plus, I think a lot of these people are drunk with the power that they have. They're not inclined to give that up easily, and that's our issue here in Australia. You know, we have prime ministers, state premiers who are declaring, "I don't want to hang out with the unvaccinated." That's a direct quote from one of them. And you know, you unvaccinated, you better watch out. And that's what we get from 2 state premiers here. So it ain't going to stop. And that's a sad thing. I believe that I lived in a free nation. I now acknowledge fully that I don't, and that the rules that I was unaware of have changed that for me permanently. I now realize that I don't live in a free country. I am free to earn money and live my life. Everything else is up for grab. And how I earn that money, or how I care to conduct my life, is their responsibility. And this is what they're saying. They're responsible for my health, so they believe I should have a vaccine, and I'm out of choices. Yeah. So, you know, sorry if I sound a bit sort of weird about it all, but it's very confusing. They've done.
No, I think a lot of people that.
You know,
yeah, I was just going to say, I think there are a lot of people that agree with you. Sorry. Sorry. A little bit of a delay, I think, with it's amazing. Isn't it amazing, though, that we're talking across the world, which I have to say is pretty cool. But no, I think there are a lot of people who feel the same way.
I think this is probably the most threatening forum for our governments that they could possibly ever imagine. You might be aware that we've just recently passed a law where our security agencies here can now monitor any person within Australia, or even externally from Australia, through their mobile phones or cyber or computer or whatever. And not only that, they can actually change what's on your phone or on your computer. So they could happily upload, shall we say, some naughty photographs to your mobile phone and not tell anyone. And there's no judicial process apart from a regulatory process for that.
Well,
so it's scary.
We found out our government was illegally spying on us a long time ago. So welcome to the club. All right, Mike from Australia, thank you very much for being willing to tell your story. I hope you'll come back on when there's more specific stuff that we can talk about.
One plug for my charity. It's called www.greymatters.org.au, and a donation would be great, because our government funding may be very thin on the ground at the moment, if we have any funding from them at all, ever.
And what is the charity?
It's a peer support group for people with brain tumors.
Okay. Okay. A worthy cause.
Yeah. No one gets a wage in my group. We do it all voluntarily.
Okay. Very cool. All right, Mike. We'll see you next time. There's something crazy coming out of Fortress, Australia. Thanks again.
Oh God, that means you'll be on here in the next day.
Yeah, we'll see you tomorrow.